He had a kingdom of his own, and he cast her out to keep it. For 6 years, Saris Verlaine quietly held that kingdom together. She balanced what no one else noticed, solved what no one else saw, loved a man who believed the future of a realm could be measured by a single heir. Then a healer spoke the truth no crown wanted to hear. By the end of the week, she had lost her title, her marriage, and the only home she had ever known. He believed he had protected his kingdom. He had no idea what it would cost to lose the woman who had been holding it together all along. This is the story of a kingdom that discovered her worth only after she was gone, and of another that saw it before she ever needed to prove it. Her name was Saris Verlaine. This is how she stopped surviving, and finally found somewhere she never had to earn the right to belong. Chapter 1. For 6 years, Saris Verlaine had learned to notice problems before anyone else noticed they existed. A late shipment, a miscounted granary, a quarrel between 2 houses that would become a feud if no one intervened within the week. She noticed these things the way some people notice weather, automatically, before it occurred to her that noticing was a skill at all. That morning, she was bent over a merchant's tally in the receiving hall, correcting a number that would have cost the Eastern farms half a winter's grain. Her hands were cold, the way they always were, though the fire beside her burned high. She had stopped noticing that about herself years ago. Others had too. A steward found her there. He didn't explain why the council wanted her in the healer's chamber. He didn't need to. She had known, in the quiet way a person knows weather is turning, for months. Minerva asked the council to leave before she spoke. None of them moved. Saris understood in that single refusal everything the room had already decided about her. She would not be given the dignity of hearing this alone, as a woman. She would hear it as a matter of state, with witnesses, because that was what she had become to them, somewhere in the last 6 years, without anyone telling her the transition had happened. Minerva did not soften what came next. There is no more waiting to be done. Your body will not carry an heir. It was decided long before this winter. A fever when you were a girl that left more behind than the scar you carry for it. The council did not gasp. Councils rarely do. They simply went still, the stillness of men recalculating what a woman was worth to them. Edian's hands had gone flat against the table. Is there any possibility? None. Another opinion. Another healer. Minerva didn't blink. You may call every healer between here and the coast. None of them will tell you differently. He didn't speak again. Saris watched him do the thing she had watched him do for 6 years. Take a truth and turn it over until it became a decision he could live with. She had loved that about him once. The care. The weight he gave to choosing. She had never imagined being the thing he chose against. She left the chamber before he did. In the corridor, a young scribe caught up to her, breathless, a leaf of parchment in his hand. Lady Saris, the Eastern report. Before you go in, could you... She took it without breaking stride, found the error on the second line, corrected it, handed it back. She had corrected the kingdom one last time. No one noticed. He did not speak again that day, nor the next. For nearly 3 weeks, Ashgard's king said almost nothing at all, closeting himself with physicians who told him nothing new, with advisors who told him what he already feared, searching for a version of the truth he could bear to keep. Saris watched him search. She said nothing to make it easier. She had learned, in 6 years, that some things were not hers to carry for him. The council's patience did not last 3 weeks. It rarely does, for kings who hesitate. When Edian finally spoke again, it was not to her. It was to the council, and what he told them was the shape of a decision already made, dressed up as one still being reached. The line cannot end with me. He did not look at her while he said it. He believed it. That was the worst part. He wasn't lying to them. He was lying to himself, carefully, the way a man builds a wall he intends to stand behind for the rest of his life. A new betrothal was announced within the fortnight. Saris heard it the way everyone else did, from a hallway, secondhand, as though she were already a guest in a house that had once been hers. Though more than one person in that court would later insist they'd seen the ending coming for years, they simply hadn't said so while it could still have mattered. The banishment took less time than the tally she'd corrected that morning. He said it in front of the full court, because that was the only way to make it final, and because some part of him needed witnesses to make himself believe he had the right. He looked at her, then at the council. Then, after a silence that went on long enough for the whole hall to feel it, he spoke. "You will leave Ashgard before the week is out." A pause, because 6 years apparently required an accounting. "You never gave this kingdom a future." She let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "No, I gave it everything else. You simply never counted it." No one laughed. No one dared. But something in the hall shifted, the attention of people realizing too late that they had never once heard her raise her voice, and had mistaken that for having nothing to say. They gave her a horse for the journey, an old gelding, sway-backed, half forgotten in the lower stables. The stable boy kept his eyes on the ground as he handed over the reins. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I brought the wrong horse." She looked the animal over, ran a hand along its neck. "No. You brought the horse they gave you." She left through the lower yard rather than the main gate, though no one had asked her to. The old accountant stood in the doorway of his office and did not pretend to be doing anything else. The cook came out to the kitchen step, wiping her hands on her apron, and said nothing at all, which said everything. A guard at the yard wall watched her pass and did not salute, because no one had told him whether he still owed her that, and the not knowing was its own kind of answer. None of them moved to stop it. None of them could. They lived inside the same system that had just decided what she was worth, and they knew it as well as she did. She did not look back at any of them. Not because she was strong enough not to want to, because she had already decided, somewhere between the healer's chamber and this road, that Ashgard would not get to watch her grieve it. She had no letters of introduction, no coin beyond what fit in one saddlebag, no plan beyond the border, and beyond the border, whatever waited. At the border, she stopped the horse. Behind her lay 6 years, a title, a name she had worn longer than her own. She looked at the ring on her hand for a long moment before she worked it free and pressed it to the bottom of the saddlebag. She did not throw it. Those 6 years had happened. They had mattered once. They were simply over now. She did not know yet who she was if she was no longer the woman who belonged to Ashgard. She crossed the border before nightfall, still trying to answer that. She believed she was riding toward exile. She was not. The land changed before the kingdom did. Ashgard's roads ran straight and gray, hemmed by stone walls built to keep track of where everything belonged. A day past the border, the walls gave out. The road began to curve around things instead of through them. An old oak, a stream, a hill no one had bothered to level. The sky opened wider than she remembered sky being allowed to. It was the last week of spring. She noticed it the way she noticed everything now, out of habit rather than feeling. The hedgerows thick with new green, the air carrying the restlessness of a season about to turn. She did not yet let herself want anything from that turning. Wanting had not gone well for her lately. The gelding, despite its age, seemed to walk easier the farther they went. She wondered, somewhere around the second day, whether an animal could feel a change in what was expected of it. She did not examine that thought further. She reached the outer checkpoint of Larkhaven at dusk on the third day, saddle-sore, her provisions down to half a loaf of bread and less pride than she'd started with. A guard asked her name before he asked her business. Saris Verlaine. He waited, the way people always had, for the rest of it. Lady. Consort. Luna of. Something to follow the name and give it weight. Nothing followed. She realized standing there that this was the first time in 6 years the silence after her name had belonged to her rather than to what she'd lost. They did not turn her away. Larkhaven, she would learn, rarely turned anyone away at the gate. a fact that told her more about the kingdom than anything she'd been able to see of it in the fading light. She was brought before its alpha 2 mornings later. The hall surprised her. No towering columns, no throne built to be looked up at. Just a long table, a fire, and a man standing near the window with his back half turned, as though her arrival were not yet worth his full attention. Rhys Delacroix did not look like a king built to be feared. He looked like a man who had once expected to be, and had learned since that fear cost more than it earned. He hadn't turned when he spoke. "You're the one from the border post." Not a question. "Yes." Ashgard. The word left him the way a man names an old injury, flatly, from long habit. "You'll understand if I don't take that at face value. We've had Ashgard's people at this border before. Not all of them came without a purpose. I have no purpose here." She kept her voice level. She had spent 6 years making sure it gave away nothing it didn't intend to. "I have nowhere else." He turned then and studied her the way she imagined he studied a border dispute, carefully, for the detail no one else had thought to mention. He let the silence run its full length before he spoke again. She would learn, in time, that this was simply how he listened, all the way to the end of a thing, never cutting it short. "What did you do in Ashgard? Not who sent you. Not what do you want?" She almost didn't have an answer ready for it. 6 years of an answer, and none of it fit into a sentence a stranger would believe. She took a moment before answering. Whatever no one else had time to notice. Eventually that became everything. Something moved behind his expression. Not warmth. Not yet. Recognition, maybe, of a kind of person he hadn't expected to find on the losing end of Ashgard's gate. He turned fully from the window, for the first time since she'd entered the room. "You'll work. Larkhaven doesn't keep guests. It hasn't given a place to." "Of course." Something eased, almost imperceptibly, in his face. "Good." He rested a hand against the back of a chair. "People who come here to spy tend to dislike ordinary work. It bores them." "I've never found it boring." "A beat." "No, I don't imagine you would." The door opened before he could say anything further. A girl, 16, maybe 17, dark-haired and breathless from running, stopped hard in the doorway at the sight of a stranger. Her name came out in the tone of an older brother who'd said it many times before. "Imogen." Sorry, she didn't look sorry. She didn't look away from Seris either, not for the length of several seconds that felt, to Seris, like being read from the inside out. Then she was gone again, the door swinging shut behind her, footsteps already retreating down the corridor. He continued as though the interruption hadn't happened. "You'll stay in the East Wing, near the kitchens." Seris inclined her head and left without asking anything further. There would be time, she suspected, for the rest of it. Rhys stood a while longer at the window after she'd gone. He didn't hear Imogen return until she was already behind him. "Can I meet her?" "No." A pause. Then, entirely unbothered, "All right." She was smiling when she said it. He didn't see that either, but he would soon enough understand exactly what that smile had meant. Before we continue, if you felt something in this first chapter that made you want to stay, please subscribe to the channel. It takes 1 second, and it means a lot to me. Chapter 2. Her room in the East Wing was small, plain, and entirely her own, a fact that took longer to settle into her than the room itself had taken to reach. No one came to inspect it. No one asked what she intended to do with it. She spent the first morning simply standing in it, listening to a household that did not yet know what to make of her. She heard the knock before she saw the door move. Imogen didn't wait to be told to come in. She was already halfway across the threshold by the time Seris turned, a girl built entirely out of momentum, dark hair escaping whatever knot someone had attempted that morning. "You're the one from Ashgard." "I am." Imogen studied her the way she'd studied her in the hall 2 days before, openly, without the manners that usually softened that kind of looking. Whatever she found, it seemed to satisfy something. "Can you braid hair?" Of all the questions Saris had braced herself for, this had not been one of them. "I can. Mine never sits right." Imogen dropped onto the edge of the bed as though she'd been invited, which she hadn't, and as though this were a conversation already well underway, which it wasn't. "The maids do it too tight. Rhys doesn't notice. He wouldn't notice if I shaved it off." "I doubt that." "You haven't met him properly yet." A shrug, entirely unbothered by her own contradiction. "He notices everything. He just doesn't say so." Saris filed that away without comment. She sat behind the girl and began undoing the knot the maids had left. And for a while, neither of them spoke. It was Imogen who broke the silence, eventually, the way she seemed to break most silences, without warning and without apparent need for one. "He gave you work. That means something." "Does it?" "He doesn't give work to people he thinks are lying." A pause, considering. "He gives them a room and watches them for a month first. You got the room and the work." "Perhaps he's simply efficient." Imogen laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though she hadn't expected Saris to have humor in her at all. "He's not efficient. He's careful. There's a difference." She tilted her head back, checking the progress of the braid upside down, which accomplished nothing except making Saris start over. "You're careful too. I can tell." "How?" "You answer everything like you're choosing each word out of a drawer." Imogen sat back up before Saris could object to the metaphor. "People who are hiding something usually talk too much or too little. You talk exactly the right amount. That's harder to fake." Saris said nothing to that, because there was nothing true she could say that wouldn't confirm precisely how closely she'd just been read by a girl who couldn't yet sit still through her own hair care. Rhys found them like that, some while later, though neither heard him in the doorway, until Imogen glanced up. He didn't come in. He had the look of a man who'd meant to say something else entirely, and had lost track of it. "The council wants the Eastern grain count by evening." Imogen didn't turn from the mirror. "You could ask her." "Ask her what?" "She kept a kingdom running for 6 years. I imagine she can count grain." Saris kept her hands steady on the last of the braid. Rhys didn't answer right away. He rarely did. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to either of them directly, more like a thought that had escaped before he'd finished deciding whether to have it. "We'll see." He was gone before Imogen could say anything else, though she clearly had something ready. "That's the closest thing to yes you'll get out of him for at least a week." She said it, satisfied, as though she'd won something. "Also, you did that beautifully. No one's done it properly since our mother." She said it lightly, the way people say things they've practiced saying lightly, and left before Saris could decide whether to ask about it, which, Saris suspected, was exactly the point. Alone again, she looked at her own hands for a moment. They had corrected a kingdom's numbers only days ago. Now they had braided a girl's hair, badly missed by someone, and been trusted with both without asking for either. She did not yet understand what kind of place this was. She was beginning, despite herself, to want to find out. Ashgard, that same week. A shipment meant for the Eastern garrison arrived 3 days late, its count short by nearly a fifth. No one could say, afterward, exactly whose desk the error had passed through. It had simply passed through several, the way things did now, unremarked, uncorrected, until they weren't. In the meanwhile, Larkhaven's kitchens ran hotter and louder than anything Saris had grown used to in Ashgard's cold, orderly halls. She found her way there on the 4th morning, drawn less by hunger than by the sound of it. Voices, pans, the chaos of a place that fed a household without pretending to be elegant about it. The cook was a broad woman named Della, flour to her elbows, who looked up at the newcomer in her doorway with the frank assessment of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by anyone's title. "You're the one Rhys gave a room to." "I am." Della went back to her dough. "He doesn't do that often." Saris found herself, without quite deciding to, picking up a knife and starting on the vegetables no one had asked her to touch. Della didn't object. She simply made room at the board, the way a person makes room for someone who's clearly done this before. They worked without speaking for a while. It was Della who broke it, eventually, nodding at the tally slate hanging crooked by the pantry door. That thing's been wrong for a month. Steward can't make the count match the stores, and no one's got the patience to sit with it. Seris glanced at the slate, found the error in under a minute, a supplier's delivery logged twice, a season passed. It's not the count that's wrong. It's this entry. She pointed. Someone recorded the same delivery under 2 different dates. Della stared at the slate, then at her, then said nothing at all. Which, Seris was beginning to learn, was Larkhaven's particular way of paying a compliment. She fixed it before she left the kitchen. No one had asked her to. She hadn't asked herself either. It was Imogen who found her afterward, trailing into the corridor with the loose-limbed energy of someone who had nowhere urgent to be, and had decided Seris's company was the most interesting available option. Della likes you, Imogen announced it as though reporting a verified fact. She doesn't talk to people. She talked to you. We discussed a supply error. That's talking. For Della. Imogen fell into step beside her, matching nothing about her pace to anyone's convenience but her own. You fixed the slate too, didn't you? I heard the steward this morning. He thought he'd finally lost his mind. It was a small thing. You keep saying that. Imogen looked at her sideways, curious rather than accusing. About everything you do. It's never a small thing. You just call it that. Seris didn't answer. There wasn't a version of the truth that fit comfortably into the space Imogen had left for it. They reached the courtyard, where the morning light had gone warm enough to sit in, and Imogen dropped onto the low wall without asking whether Seris intended to keep walking. She didn't. She sat. For a while, neither of them said anything. It was Imogen, of course, who ended it. She seemed constitutionally unable to leave a silence past its welcome. You miss him. It wasn't a question. Seris considered several answers, and chose the true one. Sometimes. Imogen nodded slowly, the way people nod when they believe they've solved something. You'll stop. Seris looked out at the courtyard rather than at her. She didn't correct it. There was no version of the correction a 16-year-old needed to hear, and no kindness in giving it to her anyway. Maybe, she said instead, which was not agreement, and not quite a lie either. Imogen seemed satisfied regardless, young enough still to believe some wounds simply ran out, the way a fever broke, the way a season ended, rather than the way Seris had actually learned to carry hers. Not gone, only quieter, only less often standing between her and the rest of a day. She let the girl believe the easier version. It cost her nothing, and it seemed to matter to Imogen a great deal. This idea that whatever Ashgard had done could be fully outrun, that a person could simply arrive somewhere new and leave the old ache entirely at the border, the way Seris had left the ring at the bottom of her saddlebag. She had not, in fact, left it entirely at the border. She had only stopped, for the first time in longer than she could remember, wanting to go back for it. That, she was beginning to suspect, might be the only kind of stopping that was actually true. Ashgard's trade agreement with the Southern Merchants Guild collapsed within a fortnight of the new betrothal, not from any single failure, but from 100 small oversights no one had been assigned to catch. Harpa Vasur received the guild's representatives herself, in a gown chosen for the occasion, and charmed them for the better part of an hour before anyone thought to mention the tariff schedule. She smiled through the parts she didn't understand, and nodded through the parts she didn't hear. A shipment misrouted, a tariff miscalculated, a guild representative left waiting 3 days for an audience that used to take an afternoon to arrange. Edian signed the replacement terms without reading them fully. He would not understand, for months yet, what that single signature would eventually cost him, or how much of it had already been decided in a room where Charm had stood in for counsel. In the meanwhile, the library at Larkhaven was smaller than Ashgard's, and better used. Seris found this out by accident, returning a book she'd borrowed without asking anyone's permission, and found the librarian, An older man named Thane, ink-stained and unbothered by the fact that a stranger had been reading his shelves without introduction. "You brought it back early." "I finished it." He looked at her properly for the first time, the way a man looks at someone who has just said something he didn't expect to hear in his own library. "Nobody finishes that one early." She didn't explain that she'd read faster her whole life than anyone around her had ever noticed, because noticing what she read had never mattered as much as noticing what she'd corrected. He didn't ask further. He simply found her a second book, better suited, and said nothing else about it, which by now she recognized as Larkhaven's fondest form of welcome. It was Imogen who arranged the ride, 3 days later, with the transparency of someone who had never once succeeded at subtlety and had stopped trying. "You haven't seen anything past the castle walls?" She announced it as though this were a wrong requiring immediate correction. "Reese is riding out to the northern pastures anyway. You're coming." "Did he ask for company?" "He will." Imogen was already halfway out the door. "He just doesn't know it yet." She was, predictably, right. The heat had arrived properly by then. Full summer. The kind that Ashgard's stone halls had never let in. The kind that made the fields look gold rather than merely green. Saris rode beside Reese in a silence that had stopped feeling like distance somewhere in the last several weeks. Though she couldn't have said exactly when, he didn't fill it with conversation. He rarely did. But he pointed out things as they passed. A boundary marker that had been disputed for a decade before his father settled it. A stretch of orchard planted the year he was born. Offering them the way some men offered compliments, sparingly, and only when they were true. "You know every field by its history. I know what happened on the land my people live on." He said it without weight, as though it were simply the minimum a person could do. Edion knew what his land produced. There's a difference. She didn't answer that. She was still learning how much it cost her some days to hear his name spoken so plainly, without malice, as though he were simply a fact rather than a wound. They stopped at the lake past mid-afternoon, the horses left to graze at the tree line. The water sat still and bright under the sun, ringed by grass gone soft with heat. Imogen says people used to believe things about this lake. They still do. A pause. His usual one. The one she'd learned meant he was deciding how much truth to give a question. They say whoever swims in it leaves something behind. An old grief. An old name. Whatever they came here still carrying. Do you believe that? No. He looked at the water rather than at her. I think people just feel lighter when the water's warm and no one's watching them. They give the lake the credit. She almost smiled at that. The closest thing to humor she'd yet heard from him, dry and unannounced. No one's watching them. The words settled somewhere she hadn't expected them to. 6 years, she had been watched constantly, measured, assessed, weighed against what she failed to produce. Even her grief had been watched, in the end, by a full court that had wanted to see how she'd take the news. Here, there was the water, and the grass, and a man who'd already told her he didn't care what the lake was owed. She was the one who moved first. She hadn't planned to. She simply found herself at the water's edge, and then in it, the cold shock of it giving way almost instantly to the sun-warmed shallows, and for the first time in longer than she could measure, she laughed, genuinely, without meaning to, at nothing in particular, except the sheer strangeness of being somewhere no one required anything of her at all. Reese watched her from the bank for a moment before he followed. He didn't speak when he reached her. That, too, had become familiar. His silences said more than most men's declarations, and this one said something she wasn't yet ready to name. You don't do that. Follow, without thinking first. I thought first. The water moved gently between them. I decided quickly. That's new. You make some things easier to decide. She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that says everything a person has spent years not saying. He didn't look away from it, which was answer enough. Neither of them moved toward the shore. There was no one to see them. No council. No court. no one waiting to decide what this meant about either of them. It occurred to her, distantly, that this might be the first want she'd let herself have in 6 years without first calculating what it would cost her. When he finally closed the distance, it wasn't sudden. It was the ending of something that had been arriving for weeks. She met him halfway, because for once there was nothing to manage before she allowed herself to want it. The kiss was unhurried, the way everything about him seemed to be, as though he'd already decided this was worth doing properly and had simply been waiting for the right amount of silence to pass first. When it ended, neither of them moved to explain it. The lake didn't do that. No, he hadn't let go of her hand. I don't imagine it did. They rode back as the light went long and gold across the fields, saying very little, though for the first time since she'd crossed the border, the quiet between them felt like something she was keeping rather than something she'd lost. Imogen was waiting in the courtyard when they returned, waiting the way she always was, as though she'd simply known. Her eyes went from Saris's damp hem to the space between their hands, still close, not quite touching. She said nothing at all. She smiled once, to herself more than to either of them, and walked away without a word, which told Saris she hadn't needed one. It was only later, alone in her room, that the ease of the afternoon began to fray at its edges. She knew this shape. Not the water, not the man. The shape of the thing itself. First a gesture, then a closeness that felt like safety. Then, eventually, an expectation she wouldn't see coming until it had already decided what she owed it. She had lived inside that shape for 6 years before it ended in a hall full of witnesses. She told herself she needed a few days. She did not examine, too closely, what she was protecting herself from. Only that the wanting itself had frightened her more than the water had. Rhys did not ask why she kept to the east wing over the days that followed. He simply gave her the space, the way he gave most things, without demanding an explanation first, trusting that if she wanted to say something, she eventually would. Neither of them yet understood that they had just done, separately, exactly what they believed was kindest for the other, and that it was very nearly the same mistake, worn 2 different ways. Ashgard lost the eastern garrison before the month was out, not to an army, but to neglect. The commander who requested reinforcements waited 3 weeks for an answer that used to take 3 days. By the time it came, the pass had already changed hands. No one in the court could say precisely who had failed to forward the request. Several people, in fact, insisted it had never reached them at all. The distance between them broke first on her side, though neither of them would have called it breaking. She found him in the map room on the 4th morning, bent over a boundary dispute that clearly wasn't his to solve, doing it anyway because no one else had. She didn't apologize for the days she'd kept to the east wing. He didn't ask her to. "You've been avoiding the courtyard. I've been thinking." About the water? About what came after it. That earned her the full weight of his attention, the kind he gave slowly, as though deciding how much of it a moment deserved. "I didn't take the days as an answer. I took them as a question you weren't ready to ask yet." She hadn't expected to be understood that precisely, and it undid something in her that 4 days of solitude hadn't managed to settle. She sat across from him instead of leaving, and neither of them mentioned the lake again, though the space between their hands on the table had closed considerably by the time she rose to go. It was enough. He didn't need more than that, and she was learning slowly that he rarely did. The old gardener found her that same afternoon, kneeling over a plum tree he'd already given up on, roots drowned by a wet spring, bark gone soft at the base. She showed him where to cut it back, which her mother had taught her a lifetime before Ashgard, a fact she hadn't spoken aloud in 6 years, because no one there had ever asked what she knew that wasn't useful to a kingdom. He listened to all of it. He thanked her twice, which she wasn't used to, and didn't know what to do with either time. Bramble started following her the next day. No one summoned him. He simply appeared at her door one morning, an old, gray, muzzled hound who belonged by every account to Rhys, and stayed there, unbothered by her confusion, until she gave up trying to send him back. By the end of the week, he slept outside her room every night, Reese found him there once and said nothing about it at the time, though the household noticed, the way households notice everything eventually. He asked Della about it first, offhand, the way he asked most things that actually mattered to him. "Has she asked you for anything?" Della didn't look up from her dough. "Not once." He asked the gardener the same question 2 days later. The answer came the same. He asked Thane in the library, expecting by then to hear something different. Never. Borrows. Returns early. Never once asked. Reese turned it over for the rest of that day, the way he turned over anything that didn't fit the pattern he expected. He had known people who wanted things from him his whole life: land, favor, a decision bent in their direction. He had never known someone to live in his house for 2 months and ask it for nothing at all. He didn't yet have a name for what that stirred in him. He would, before long. For now it simply sat there, unresolved, the way Bramble sat outside her door each night without anyone having told him to. That evening, alone, Saris took out paper for the first time since crossing the border. She hadn't planned to. It arrived the way old habits do, her hand moving before she'd decided anything, setting down what she remembered without letting herself think too hard about why. The Eastern Garrison's supply routes, the names of 3 commanders loyal only because they'd never been asked for more. The granary that ran empty 2 weeks before every harvest, reliably. Every year she'd overseen it. She filled 2 pages before she stopped. She read them back slowly, in the candlelight, and understood, not with any drama, only with the quiet certainty of someone finally naming a thing to herself, that she had written this down not to use it, but because carrying it silently had become its own kind of weight. A whole kingdom's machinery, memorized and unspent, still living in her hands. She thought of the ring at the bottom of her saddlebag. She had not thrown that away either. But a ring was only ever hers to keep or set down. This was different. This was Ashgard's. Still, in every line. And she did not want to be the woman who carried a kingdom inside her for the rest of her life, waiting to see what it might be worth to someone. She held the pages over the candle until they caught, and set them in the hearth, and watched until there was nothing left to read. She did not feel triumphant. She felt for the first time in months entirely unburdened, as though she had finally set down something she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it had a weight at all. Outside her door, Bramble shifted, sighed once, and settled back into sleep, the way he did every night now, as though he had already decided, long before anyone else in that house, exactly where he meant to stay. 2 of Ashgard's oldest noble houses withdrew from the royal council within the same week, quietly, without formal complaint, the way old families leave when they've stopped believing a thing is worth saving, rather than when they've decided to fight for it. Harpa noticed something else leaving the hall alongside them, the last of whatever attention Edion had once paid her, back when she was still new enough to be mistaken for a solution. He was courteous to her. He had never once, in all these months, asked her what she thought. She had married a crown. She was beginning to understand she had not married a husband. Edion noticed the empty council seats before he understood what they meant. He would go on not understanding for a while yet that a council does not empty itself. It is emptied, one disappointed absence at a time. It's the height of summer. Nobody has done anything enjoyable in weeks, Reese included, especially Reese. They ended up at the lake by midday, Imogen, Saris, Della's cold spread of bread and summer fruit, and Reese, who had claimed he had reports to finish and appeared within the hour anyway, without explaining why the reports could apparently wait. Bramble arrived last, uninvited, and installed himself directly between Saris and the food, with the confidence of a creature who had never once been told no in his life. He didn't used to like anyone this much. Reese watched the dog watch Saris's bread with open longing. He tolerated me. He barely tolerates the stable hands. He has good instincts. Imogen said it, entirely too pleased with herself. Later, while Reese waded out to check a fishing line Imogen swore was still tied somewhere in the reeds, Imogen turned to Saris, with the focus she reserved for questions she'd clearly been saving. Teach me the braid again. Properly this time. I want to remember it without you doing it for me. Seer showed her twice, patient with the girl's clumsy fingers, and by the third attempt, Imogen had something close to right. She wore it that way for the rest of the afternoon, and when one of the stable hands passed and remarked that her hair looked different, Imogen answered before she'd thought about what the answer revealed. Seer taught me. She said it simply, the way a fact gets stated rather than confessed, and didn't seem to notice, as Seer did, that somewhere in the last 2 months, this girl had begun reaching for a version of herself that looked a little more like the woman braiding her hair by the lake. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the things Imogen had decided, unprompted, that she wanted to know. How to read a household's ledgers without a steward standing over her shoulder. How to tell, from the way a servant answered a question, whether they were telling the whole truth or only the comfortable half. How to sit in a room full of men who expected her to say nothing and say exactly enough. Nobody's taught me any of this. Imogen said it, chewing on a plum, entirely unbothered by how much she was admitting. They teach me embroidery, and which fork to use. Nobody teaches you how to actually run anything. They didn't think you'd need it. I'm going to need all of it. She said this with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided her own future and simply hadn't told anyone yet. Reese will need someone who can hold this place together when he's off being an alpha about things. It might as well be me. Reese returned from the reeds soaked to the knee and fishless, in time to catch only the tail end of that, and something crossed his face that Seer couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or the ache of watching someone he loved grow up faster than he'd noticed happening. It was Della, arriving later with a second basket, and staying to gossip in the shade, who said the thing that settled over the afternoon like the last of the day's heat. That girl's going to make someone a fine mother of daughters one day. Way she takes to teaching. The comment wasn't aimed at anyone. Della hadn't meant it to land the way it did. But Imogen, without looking up from the grass she was braiding into a second, worse imitation of Seer's work, answered before anyone else could fill the silence. She'd be a good mother now. Not the way people usually mean it. A shrug, entirely unbothered by what she was saying or who was listening, just not the way anyone expected. No one corrected her. No one asked her to explain further. Seer said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have broken something in her voice she didn't want anyone at that lake to hear. Reese was the only one watching her when it was said. He didn't look away, and he didn't offer her anything so clumsy as sympathy. He simply let the moment pass, the way he let most things pass, fully, without rushing her through it, and reached over, sometime after, to take the fruit Bramble had been failing to steal from her hand, which was its own kind of mercy, giving her somewhere else to look. The sun was low by the time they packed up to leave. Imogen walked ahead with Bramble, narrating something to him he had no interest in, and for a moment Seer and Reese were alone on the path, the lake behind them, the castle not yet in view. She's not wrong, you know, about any of it. Seer didn't answer right away. She found for once that she didn't need to. Edion called for the muster in the height of summer, 3,000 men, a route through the southern passes, and a target that had less to do with reclaiming territory than with proving, to a council that had stopped believing in him, that he could still take something by force since he had failed to hold anything by care. The southern villages sat directly in the path of that proof, undefended, because no one in Ashgard's command had thought to ask what lay beyond the ridge they meant to cross. The news reached Larkhaven through a trader 3 days before it reached anyone official, Ashgard's banners massing at the southern pass, a route that ran, by the terrain alone, directly past 3 farming villages that had never held a wall in their history because no one had ever needed to attack them from that direction. Reese read the report twice at the long table, Seer standing across from him, and said the thing plainly, because there was no other way to say it. There's no fortification along that ridge. If his column moves through there, those villages have nothing between them and 3,000 men who've been told to take something home. He won't order it against civilians. He won't have to. Reese set the report down. An army moving fast through unfamiliar ground doesn't distinguish. It just moves. She knew the ridge. She had known it for 6 years, knew which pass flooded, which held through autumn, which one Ashgard's own scouts avoided, because the footing turned to nothing in wet weather, and no one had ever bothered to fix it. She said none of it. She had burned the pages. She had told herself, watching them catch, that she was done being a woman who carried a kingdom's machinery inside her, waiting to see what it might be worth. She had meant that. She still meant it. She didn't sleep that night. She sat with the knowledge the way she'd once sat with a ledger that refused to balance, turning it over, looking for the version of doing nothing that didn't end with children in a farmhouse hearing horses before dawn. There wasn't one. She rose before first light and found, at the bottom of her old saddlebag, beneath the ring she'd never thrown away, a worn map she'd carried out of habit, more than purpose. It only pointed. The knowing was still hers. Rhys found her there an hour later, the map open on the table. He didn't ask what had changed her mind. He waited, the way he waited for everything, until she was ready to say it herself. There's another pass. He listened while she traced it, narrower, slower, a full day ahead of the route Edian's column meant to take, coming out on the far side of the ridge before he could reach it. If Rhys's men held that ground first, the column would have nowhere to go but around. Silence after. Then, why now? She looked toward the window. Outside, the men hadn't yet been told they were riding. Because children live there. He didn't press for more. He studied her instead. Not the way he'd studied her at their first meeting, searching for a lie, but the way a man looks at someone he has already decided to trust, and is only now understanding the full weight of it. Can you live with this? I couldn't live with the other choice. He touched her hand once, over the table. It asked nothing. It gave everything. Then we ride within the hour. She stood in the courtyard afterward, watching the men assemble faster than she'd ever seen Ashgard move for anything. If this were vengeance, she thought, I would have stayed silent. She had not returned to Ashgard. She had carried Larkhaven with her. The pass held. Ashgard's column found the mountain route blocked before dawn, and turned around a full day before reaching the villages at all. No battle was fought, no village burned. The story that reached Ashgard's court afterward was simply that the campaign had failed, quietly, without spectacle, the way most of Edian's failures had begun to fail that year. It was the council, not Edian, who finally asked the question that mattered. They were reviewing the season's failures, the trade collapse, the empty council seats, the garrison lost without a battle, when one of the older lords, tired past the point of diplomacy, asked who had once handled the eastern reports before they'd started arriving late. Lady Seris. Someone answered, before remembering, too late, that the name was no longer meant to be spoken in that hall. Edian didn't reprimand him. He asked another question instead. Who organized the granary counts? A pause. Lady Seris. The trade audiences. Lady Seris. The Eastern Commander's supply lines. This time no one answered right away. It was the oldest steward, finally, who broke the silence, because someone had to. Lady Seris. All of it, for 6 years. Edian said nothing for a long while. He had spent months attributing each loss to its own cause, a careless clerk, an unlucky season, a treaty poorly worded. He understood now, sitting in a council chamber emptier than it had been in a decade, that he had not lost 6 separate things. He had lost the one thing that had been holding the other 6 together. He tried to write to her that night, and found he had no practice at it, 6 years of decisions handed down, and none of them had ever required him to find the right words for a woman he'd wronged. The first page went into the fire half-written. The second followed it. By the third attempt, he had stopped trying to explain anything, and simply asked, in 5 lines, whether she would consider returning, her position restored, her title, whatever terms she required. It reached Larkhaven within the week. Seris read it once, standing in the courtyard with Bramble at her feet, and did not read it again. She did not show it to Rhys. She did not need to decide anything about it, because there was no longer a question in it that required an answer from her. She would never write back. Not out of cruelty, though Edion would spend a long time believing otherwise. Rhys found her there some time later, the letter still folded in her hand. From him? Yes. He didn't ask what it said. He asked instead the only thing that seemed to matter to him. Do you need anything from me? No. A pause. I think that's the first time in my life someone's asked me that and meant it as the whole question. They walked the length of the courtyard without speaking further, Bramble trailing behind at his own unhurried pace. It was only once they'd reached the far gate, the letter long since forgotten in her pocket, that Rhys asked the other question, the one he'd apparently been carrying since the lake. Have you always been like this? Even before Ashgard? She considered it honestly, the way she considered most things he asked her. Always. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. It was, she was learning, the closest thing he had to a declaration, the simple act of believing her the first time, without requiring her to prove it twice. The formal talks began within the month, Ashgard's envoys crossing into Larkhaven under a flag neither kingdom had needed to raise in over a decade. On the morning the table was set, every seat filled but one. Rhys stood at the head of it, papers in hand, and did not begin. He waited. Seris crossed the room and took the empty seat beside him, not behind him, not at a respectful distance suited to an advisor, but beside, where the table had apparently been arranged to expect her all along. Only then did he open the session. The terms took most of the morning to settle. The returned trade routes, the disputed garrison, the border no one had ever needed marked before this year. Edion sat across the table with the stillness of a man who had rehearsed this room many times in his head and found the real version smaller than he'd feared and worse than he'd hoped. He had noticed her hand before anyone spoke a word of substance. No ring on it. He didn't ask. There was nothing left in him that had the right to. Harpa sat 2 seats down from him, dressed for the occasion the way she dressed for every occasion now, present without being consulted. No one at the table turned to her for a recommendation. She had long since stopped expecting them to. It was one of Larkhaven's envoys, midway through the second hour, who turned the question toward her without hesitation, the way a person asks anyone whose opinion has already proven worth asking. Lady Seris, your recommendation on the eastern route? She gave it plainly, the way she gave most things, the flooding pattern, the season it favored, the cost of ignoring either. No one looked to Rhys first to see if she was permitted to answer. No one looked to Edion at all. Edion understood, watching it happen, that this was the thing he had never once given her in 6 years. Not land, not title. The simple absence of anyone needing to ask permission for her voice. Near the end of the session, an older lord from Ashgard's own delegation, hoping perhaps to salvage something of the morning, asked whether Larkhaven intended any further conditions, reparations, concessions, some accounting still to be settled. No. Seris said it before Rhys could answer for her, though he wouldn't have. None. Edion looked at her for a long moment. He had come to this table braced for a reckoning. He had not braced for the absence of one, and found it cost him far more than any accusation would have. The door opened before the silence could finish. Imogen crossed the room without asking anyone's leave, the way she crossed most rooms, and settled into the empty space beside Seris's chair, as though it had always belonged to her. No explanation offered, none required. Bramble followed a moment later and lay down at Seris's feet, with the unhurried certainty of a creature who had long since stopped needing to be told where he stood. No one at the table remarked on either arrival. Edion did not need them to. He had spent 6 years measuring what a person could give a kingdom. He understood, watching a girl lean naturally into a woman he'd once called worthless, and a dog choose her floor over anyone else's, that he was looking at the thing he'd told the court she'd failed to provide. Not an heir. A family. She had built one in less than a season, out of people who owed her nothing, in a house that wasn't hers to begin with. She had done it once before, too, in a kingdom he had ruled. He had simply never called it that. It was Reese who spoke last, once the terms were all but settled, the room already loosening into the ease of men who have finished the hard part of their work. He didn't rise. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply turned to her, in front of both delegations, in front of the man who had once told her exactly what she was worth in a hall full of witnesses. "What do you think?" It was, on its surface, nothing at all. A question any advisor might be asked at the close of any negotiation. Edion heard it differently. He had ruled beside this woman for 6 years, and never once, in all that time, asked her that question in front of anyone. He had told her what would happen. He had told her what he'd decided. He had never turned to her, in a room full of people who mattered, and asked what she thought. Saris answered simply, a small adjustment to the grain clause, nothing more, and the room moved on to it as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, because to everyone at that table, nothing had. It was only a man asking a woman her opinion, the way he always did. That, Edion understood, watching it, was precisely the point. She had not been reclaimed. She had not been avenged. She sat where she sat because the table had been built, from the start, to expect her there, beside, not behind, and no one in that room had needed to be told the difference. He rose when the session ended, and inclined his head to her once, formally, the way he might to any equal. She returned it, and nothing more. He did not ask to speak with her alone. He understood, finally, that there was nothing left to say that would undo what he had once said so plainly, in front of a full court, believing himself right. She watched him go. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, mostly unburdened, the particular lightness of a debt finally settled, owed by no one to anyone anymore. Imogen's hand found hers under the table, briefly, before the girl rose to follow Reese out. Bramble stayed a moment longer, leaning his full weight against Saris's leg, before ambling after them both. She sat alone at the table for a moment, in the seat that had always been meant for her, and let herself finally believe it. The lake looked different in early autumn, the light gone lower, gentler, the water no longer holding quite the sun it had all summer. Bramble reached it first, as he always did now, and waded in without ceremony, unbothered by the temperature in a way the rest of them clearly were not. "It's freezing," Imogen announced it ankle-deep and already regretting it. "Whose idea was this?" "Yours." Reese said it. 2 hours ago, very insistent. "I take it back." She didn't take it back. She was in up to her knees within the minute, complaining the entire way. And by the time Saris joined her, the complaining had turned to something closer to delight, the kind that only came from someone who'd forgotten, for a moment, that dignity was a thing to be managed. Reese stayed at the edge a while longer, watching them both, before he waded in without announcing it, the way he did most things. Imogen swam off toward the far bank eventually, chasing something Bramble had decided was worth chasing. And for a while it was only the two of them. The water settled and quiet around them the way it had been that first summer afternoon. "Do you still miss that place?" She thought about it honestly, the way she considered most things he asked her. "Sometimes I miss the woman I was there." She watched Imogen and the dog make their long, splashing way back toward them. "But I wouldn't trade her for the woman I became." He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He simply took her hand beneath the water, where no one could see it, though by now there was no one left who would have minded seeing it at all. Imogen asked her once, that evening, walking back up from the water, with her hair still dripping, whether she thought she'd ever leave Larkhaven, go somewhere else, start again, the way people sometimes did. Saris looked back at the castle, warm lit against the coming dark, at the girl beside her who had decided, on nothing more than instinct, to call her family before anyone had asked her to. "My future's already here." It was the same word Ashgard had once used against her. The last thing she'd been told she'd failed to give. Some words simply wait for the right mouth to carry them home. Some doors once closed, deserved to stay that way. This one, she never looked back through again. Thank you so much for being here until the very end. If this story stayed with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I truly love hearing from you. And if you want more stories, subscribe, be part of my library. A new story is always waiting. I'll see you in the next one.